Hi, Tracy Gillard. Thank you so much for being here today and letting us interview you. So our first question is just a general one. What does palliative care mean to you?
That's a really good question. Can I start by the thing it's not and then explain what it means? Is that all right? A lot of people equate palliative care with end-of-life care, and they're slightly different things. So end-of-life care is often the last days or weeks of somebody's life, and that's generally a lot of medical intervention and those sorts of things, pain relief. Palliative care can actually start much, much earlier than that. Some people have long-term diseases, so you may have heard of motor neurone disease, ice bucket challenge, those sorts of things. Those journeys can be very long, and palliative care is something that comes in when anyone is diagnosed with a life-limiting illness, and it can follow them all the way through until they're at the end of life. So it's different things for different people, but it's much more than most people think.
It's very interesting. So tell us a bit about your journey. How did you end up working in palliative care?
Another good question. Palliative care, I was one of the people who thought it was end-of-life care, I have to say, before I got involved. My mother was diagnosed with motor neurone disease, and her disease progression was 8 years long. And so I became quite familiar with palliative care in that sense, because you find out the loved one has a life-limiting illness, which can be quite confronting for everybody involved, particularly the person with the diagnosis. You go in and out of medical appointments and things like that. But then your world kind of narrows, and it significantly narrows down to be the things that are most valuable, because time becomes increasingly precious when you realise that you don't have much of it. So my father and my sister and I, that's our little nuclear family, we looked after Mum at home because her wish was to die at home. So it was a slow death, and if you look up motor neurone disease, it's a disease that most doctors say they wouldn't want. But she was an absolute champion, and she was just incredible throughout it. But then, she was looked after by a GP, so a general practitioner mostly, because she lived in Maria, which is down on the south coast, so not near the main cities. And we did all of her care at home. So we learned a lot then, and we had palliative care nurses come in. And when I was working for the federal government at the time, and I knew a lady who was doing some consulting in there, our lives had intersected. She was the president of the board of Palliative Care ACT, and I'd been telling her about our journey with Mum, and she was looking for a new CEO. And I had a lot of management experience because I'd worked for government for a very long time, and I had some recent personal experience that she knew about. So she thought I might be a good match. So I went and was interviewed and became the CEO of Palliative Care in 2019. So that's what led me to that role.
That's really interesting. So what did your job working in palliative care entail?
Well, the 30 years in government was very handy, because working for a big beast like the federal government, I was a small minnow in a big organisation, and I had worked in different areas of national policy, so child protection policy, Indigenous policy, youth policy, before I had grey hair. And that had given me a lot of really good experience. In the CEO role, I had a team of about 5 or 6 people and a board of about 9. So they're the overarching governance, and they were a volunteer board. We got funding from the ACT government. So I was responsible for such a broad range of things in that job that I hadn't been in government. And so I managed a small team. We managed 150 volunteers who work in the hospice and people's homes, residential aged care facilities. We had reporting to government to do. So all of those things, it was, I call myself a Jill of all trade and a master of none. But it was a really interesting time, and because I'm Canberra born and bred, it was something that was very close to my heart, being in Canberra and working in a community organisation that was making such a difference.
It's very cool. So when is palliative care necessary, and who decides on palliative care?
That's another really good question, because a lot of people don't want to know about it. So a lot of people, when they have a disease or an illness, their instinct, and that's, the human instinct, is to survive. And so we will fight it as long and as hard as possible. And a lot of the clinicians who are engaged are disease-specific clinicians, and so they will work to address the disease. The thing about palliative care is it's not about a disease, it's about the person, and it's about the life that they have. So we say it's not about quantity, it's about quality, and good palliative care can help toward the end of somebody's life to give them higher quality of life. Sorry, I've forgotten the second part of that question.
Who decides on palliative care?
The good part of that question, because people have an aversion, and naturally most of us are, as a society and culture, are quite death phobic. We don't talk about it much. In fact, I didn't even realise I was going to die till I was in about year 7 when it hit me in an art class because we don't talk about it. And I had grandparents and great-grandparents who lived very long lives, so I hadn't encountered death very much. So the fact that we don't talk about it makes it harder for people to come to terms with it when they're faced with it. So generally it's suggested, but because it's not commonplace, it's a different specialisation in the medical field. So often it's a conundrum of wanting to fight hard and not to give up. But also, the earlier that you bring palliative care in, studies have shown the longer people live and the higher quality their lives are, so, which is a really unusual sort of a conundrum, because people feel like they're giving up hope if they engage with palliative care, yet it's quite the opposite. So that means that mostly patients don't ask for palliative care, they don't request it. And we are trying to educate more people about the importance of engaging it earlier. So it's a puzzle that we're still working on.
So what does voluntary assisted dying have to do with palliative care?
Very topical question, that one, Sammy. Voluntary assisted dying is not related to palliative care is the short answer. It's more of an individual choice. And I personally believe that everybody, when it's doing no harm to anybody else, should have the choices that they are able to make and when they're able to make them for any reason, if it's a personal choice. Voluntary assisted dying is generally engaged if somebody has a disease or an illness where their quality of life is so low that they then decide themselves that death would be a preference. Palliative care is contra to that in a way, because what it does is tries to add value to life at all stages. So there is often a confusion that palliative care and voluntary assisted dying are related, but they're not really. It is a misnomer, if you like. So voluntary assisted dying can be very useful. In fact, when we nursed my mother, because there wasn't voluntary assisted dying, it took quite a long while for her to die when she chose to do it. And if voluntary assisted dying had been in place, she could have chosen the time and place and all of those sorts of things herself. And I think diseases like motor neurone disease are known to be one of the areas of, a medical condition that would potentially benefit from having that choice. So they're quite different. Good question.
An interesting idea to think about. And what do you think for you has been the greatest challenge that you faced working in palliative care?
Greatest challenge? I think there are challenges in it every day, but there's also, people say, isn't it depressing? Isn't it sad all the time? But you'd be surprised at the laughter and the love and the memories and the enthusiasm and the well-being and the, heartfelt moments that you get in this space is quite incredible. The challenges are more operational challenges. Sometimes there's funding challenges. Sometimes there's emergency things that we need to address. I'm honestly not sure. I'm a bit of a rose-coloured glasses type of person. So when you say challenges, it's thrown me. Yeah.
What's something you think you've learnt while working in palliative care?
what the true definition of palliative care is. That was one of the things. The value of life and death, the two of those, because I think we think about them generally separately and not together. I think that's one of the things I've learned. I've learned how different it is to run a community organisation than to be in a government organisation. It has its challenges. The absolute commitment and just undying, that's a bit irony, isn't it? Undying enthusiasm of our volunteers who are working in this space. To go in and to talk to people who are at their life's end, to hold their hand, to read their newspaper, to make them a crumpet, all of the things that we do, and we spend a lot of time with a lot of people who are at the end of their lives. So you get to meet some beautiful, beautiful people and they're gone, which is both uplifting because you've got to meet them at a special time in their lives, but also a bit sad sometimes because you strike up a friendship which doesn't last as long as you'd like it to. So there are, those are the sorts of things that are very special about this area of work.
And what knowledge do you think you could impart from your own experiences that would make people more comfortable about palliative care?
I don't think it's anywhere near as scary as people think. I think there are a lot of things that can benefit people by facing it. There are a lot of interventions these days, medical interventions, that might might lengthen somebody's life but don't improve somebody's life. I think educating, empowerment, being in control of what your choices are is really important. So in any time, any part of life, I think making sure that the choices that you make are the right ones for you and those that you love is really important. So letting go of loved ones, a lot of carers, in fact, I met a wonderful, wonderful carer who, her husband, young, passed away. She said she and he cared for each other and she cared for him at home. He reached a recognition that he was going to die and that it was the right time well before she did. And so there was a bit of a struggle there because he was ready but she wasn't. So there's communication around those sorts of things that are really important for people to be honest and open, and that's respecting each other and understanding what those times mean and when it's right. So there's just so much to learn. In fact, I'm just endeavouring to study again for the first time in 20 years to look at the impact that respite and non-clinical respite in particular can have for a carer and their agency in their pathway from this life, to the end of their lives. So it's, never stop learning. Yeah.
And how would you say palliative care relates to Sonder?
Really good question. And I have to admit that I had to look up Sonder because I'd never actually heard the word before. But as I was saying to Sammy, it's something that I've often thought about. I used to sit on buses in big cities and look out the window and look in somebody's eyes and think, I'll probably never, ever see you again. I've just seen you for this moment and this time right here, right now. And that, what on earth is going on in your life that I have no idea about, which I think is fascinating. And I think Sonder relates to palliative care in that way because often people are very, very discreet when they're in times like life-limiting illnesses and those sorts of things. And so you don't know what people are going through. And in palliative care, you always get a little bit extra of a snippet. So when we work in palliative care, we talk to people and they give you more of their life than they may otherwise give because they know that they don't have a lot of time, which sounds a bit odd, but they can tell you the most intimate stories. We have a program in palliative care ACT called the Life Story Program. And in that program, a volunteer sits and talks about life and sometimes gets recipes, sometimes gets photographs. And people will pick out gems of their life and share them with our volunteers and put them into a little publication. And it's just incredible. And I think Sonder, it's almost tangible Sonder. You get a little snippet into somebody else's life that you wouldn't otherwise have had nothing to do with. So, yeah, I was really excited when I did look up the term after Sammy was saying that that's your theme this year. It's really, really good.
Hey, Tracy, that was very insightful. We learned a lot.
Yeah.
My absolute pleasure, and don't be shy about talking about death. It's not a bad thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you.